Excellencies, distinguished guests, good afternoon. I want to thank the German Federal Foreign Office and the German Archaeological Institute for the kind invitation to offer some remarks about the experience of the Safeguarding the Heritage of Syria and Iraq, or SHOSI project, with you today. I have co-directed the SHOSI project since its beginning in 2013, with Corinne Wegner at the Smithonian Institution, Dr. Salam Al-Kantar at Rutgers University, and Richard Leventhal at the University of Pennsylvania. The SHOSI project has focused upon what can be done to assist our colleagues and local communities in protecting cultural heritage sites during the conflict in both countries. There is great skepticism in the current literature of the field of heritage studies that successful actions can be undertaken to protect cultural heritage during times of active armed conflict. I would disagree. The question we really need to ask is whether museums and other heritage preservation organizations have the will to organize themselves to offer humanitarian assistance in a manner similar to other NGOs that respond during conflicts and other disasters. In planning for the SHOSI project, we looked to the experience of the Society for the Preservation of Afghan Cultural Heritage, or SPACH, which was active in the years following the outset of the Afghanistan Civil War in 1994 and led by the late Nancy Dupre. SPACH was often in a situation of active experimentation about what could work in the specific context of that conflict. We found much the same in Syria. There was no particular model for action. Every project and activity had to be developed on a case-by-case basis. The SHOSI project's greatest preservation successes in Syria were driven by local heritage professionals who first identified specific sites that required protection or emergency stabilization and then worked with us to implement the project. The question was less about the expertise or training needed to conduct an emergency action and more about the project funding required. We found that most emergency preservation needs ranged between $20,000 and $25,000 US. With these small amounts of funding, we could successfully protect museums from aerial bombardment, shore up looters' pits at sites such as Ebla, and discourage looting and other damage at archaeological sites. We also found that the protection of living Syrian cultural heritage required our attention. Building on other humanitarian and educational efforts in the ancient cities of northern Syria World Heritage Site, we began working with community elders to teach traditions such as basket weaving and introduce discussions about Syrian heritage in local educational curricula. This effort, what we have called the Hikaya Heritage Initiative, is led by Mariam Bashish, who is with us in the audience today. The situation in Iraq was much different. The State Board of Antiquities and Heritage retained a great deal of ability to address the destruction by Daesh, and the SHOSI project played much more of a supporting role. With the permission of Dr. Qais Rashid, in 2015, the SHOSI project held a first aid for cultural heritage training at the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage in Erbil. This training course, based on the ICRA model, focused on emergency preservation and stabilization measures that could be undertaken by SBAH staff encountering damaged sites or looted materials. The photograph you see here is a training exercise in how to hide an artifact in plain sight from Daesh. Now in 2018, the SHOSI project is transitioning. Iraq is now moving from the moment of emergency protection to the process of reconstruction in Mosul and elsewhere. My colleagues at the Smithsonian Institution are working with Dr. Qais Rashid and the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage to build upon the prior training programs at the Iraqi Institute and to conduct a stabilization project at Nimrud. In Syria, many areas remain contested, and ongoing international political negotiations frame their possible futures, as well as the ability to implement protection projects. Much of the in-country work initiated by the SHOSI project is now supported more directly by the Syrian-led NGO CIMAT, which will be discussed in a later presentation by Dr. Shaker Shabib, who has served as an instrumental leader in the SHOSI project. The SHOSI project has clearly demonstrated that it is possible for international heritage organizations to support emergency protection measures in countries experiencing conflict alongside other humanitarian efforts. Based upon our particular experiences, I want to conclude with 5 lessons we have learned about the challenges of implementing these kinds of projects. First, we need to enhance NGO capacity in the cultural heritage sector in order to deliver emergency protection measures. Compared with other humanitarian sectors, cultural heritage NGOs are significantly underdeveloped. This situation persists mostly because cultural heritage preservation schemes are led by governments themselves. Cultural heritage is fundamentally cultural property, and generally the property of a state actor. Yet successful emergency protection initiatives require rapid responses and transparent legal reporting that is specific to the humanitarian sector. Often these conditions can only be met by an established NGO that is structured for such rapid local implementation. Ideally, such an NGO would be led by affected community members, and CMOT realizes the SHOSI project's goal of seeing such an entity established. But a crisis is not the time to build an NGO, and much work is needed to have implementing cultural heritage-oriented NGOs in regions where conflicts may occur. Second, we need more locally oriented initiatives during crisis events. Many emergency protection efforts, including SPATCH and SHOSI, have acted as flexible entities to support as-needed country-wide responses. The result is that funding and logistical efforts are spread thinly across much need. A better approach would be to encourage NGO responses at specific sites or regions that could more effectively channel funding and implement protection projects. Existing archaeological missions could play an important role because of their longevity at specific sites. We have seen the benefit of such an approach in Syria as an unexpected consequence of the SHOSI project. Small amounts of funding have encouraged the formation of the Idlib Antiquity Center, a regionally focused hub of heritage professionals acting in the city and region. As the Idlib Antiquity Center organized itself, we were better able to jointly envision, plan, and implement specifically tailored programming dedicated to the unique heritage of the region. Third, we need a specialized resettlement program for at-risk heritage professionals. Karima Banoun, the current United Nations Special Rapporteur for Cultural Rights, has emphasized the risks present to heritage professionals who are tasked or who volunteer to protect cultural heritage sites. We must take these risks seriously. Daesh's murder of Khalid al-Assad was a gut punch to heritage professionals around the world. However, at the time of his execution, I found my thoughts turning to the curators, conservators, and the technical staff of the Palmyra Museum, who had been similarly implicated in many of the so-called crimes of which Khalid al-Assad was supposedly guilty. Consultation with international archaeological missions, the preservation of idolatrous antiquities, and so on. After identifying financial support from a private U.S. foundation, the SHOSI project supported the evacuation and relocation of many of the museum staff members to Turkey. While we intended to keep the core of the staff together because of the perceived value in maintaining the museum's institutional knowledge as a functional unit, this proved to be impossible, and ultimately the staff were integrated into the international refugee system. Sadly, we must also consider the ultimate safety of heritage professionals inside the Idlib Governorate, who may ultimately require resettlement for their own personal safety. The German Archaeological Institute, and Professor Fless in particular, deserve much credit in helping Syrian heritage professionals, especially early career researchers, to relocate to Germany to continue their studies. But I think that we would all agree that we need to do more. Many heritage professionals have a master's degree, but not a doctorate, which prevents their participation in many established scholar-at-risk programs. Internationally, doctors, nurses, lawyers, and journalists have managed to address this problem as heritage professionals, we have not. Fourth, we need to identify funding lines for protecting cultural heritage to be identified before the onset of a specific crisis. The ability to conduct on-the-ground programming is dependent upon access to funding. Emergency protection measures are not well understood by governments or private foundation philanthropy. It took 10 months between the time that the SHOSI project developed its initial plans before we were able to identify a donor willing to take a risk on the implementation of its first project. Because cultural destruction during armed conflict seems as though it's an inevitability, a perception exists that nothing can be done. Much like other humanitarian programs, standing funds will need to be developed and existing funding mechanisms enhanced if protection of cultural heritage during an emergency is to be a reality. Finally, we need to become familiar with the international regulations that permit humanitarian aid. Emergency heritage protection projects are complex. There was a period of time when the SHOSI project's activities required no less than 14 permits or permissions from various governing bodies in the United States, the European Union, Turkey, and Iraq. Although the process streamlined over time, it would be well for all of us to remember that the permitting process for conducting an archaeological project may or may not resemble the permitting process for emergency heritage protection. If we are to engage in emergency heritage protection in a serious way, our organizations must come to resemble established humanitarian organizations much more. Thank you for your time and attention.